If you break your leg tomorrow, you go to a hospital. Someone sets the bone, you're back on your feet in weeks, and nobody questions whether you deserve to heal. That's just what happens now. You probably assume it was different for your ancestors. Brutal. Simple. If you couldn't keep up, you got left behind. That's the story most people believe about prehistoric life. Survival of the fittest, no room for weakness, the sick and the old abandoned to die alone. Except that's not actually what the evidence shows. And the truth, when you actually look at the bones, is going to completely flip what you think you know about how your ancestors treated their most vulnerable. Let's start with a skeleton. In Iraq, in a cave called Shanidar, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Neanderthal man who lived roughly 45,000 years ago. His skeleton tells an almost unbelievable story. His right arm had been amputated, likely above the elbow, and the bone had healed completely, meaning he survived the injury by years, possibly decades. He was also blind in one eye, from healed trauma to the skull. And his legs showed degenerative damage, so severe that walking without significant help would have been nearly impossible. This was a man who, by every survival of the fittest assumption, should not have existed past the week of his injuries. He had no functional arm, no depth perception, and likely couldn't walk without support. And yet the bones show he lived for years afterward. Someone fed him. Someone kept him warm. Someone carried him when the group moved. Someone chose, repeatedly over years, to keep this man alive even though he could contribute almost nothing physically to the group's survival. Paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkaus, who studied the Shanidar remains extensively, called this discovery a direct challenge to the assumption that Neanderthals, often stereotyped as brutish and simple, were incapable of sustained compassionate care. The bones don't lie about intention, but they do tell you what must have happened for that body to still be walking around 45,000 years ago. Someone in that group made a choice, likely many people, over a long period of time, that this man's life was worth the resources it cost to keep him alive. This isn't an isolated case. At a site in Vietnam called Man Bac, dated to around 4,000 years ago, archaeologists found the remains of a young man who had a condition causing near-total paralysis from a very young age, likely something similar to Klippel-Feil syndrome. He would have had no use of his arms or legs from childhood. And yet his bones show he lived into his 20s. In a hunter-gatherer or early agricultural context, a person that dependent should represent an enormous drain on group resources with zero physical return. He couldn't hunt. He couldn't gather. He couldn't even feed himself without assistance. Someone did that for him, every single day, for over 2 decades. Anthropologist Lorna Tilley, who studied this case in depth, developed something called the bioarchaeology of care framework specifically because cases like this kept showing up in the archaeological record, and existing theories had no good explanation for them. Tilley's research suggests that this kind of sustained care wasn't rare or exceptional in prehistoric societies. It was consistent enough across enough different sites and time periods that it points to something built into how early human groups actually functioned, not as an occasional act of unusual kindness, but as an expected structural part of group life. Here's what makes this genuinely surprising if you think about it from a purely resource scarcity angle. These groups were not living in abundance. Food was uncertain. Every calorie mattered. Carrying someone who couldn't walk across miles of difficult terrain, feeding someone who couldn't feed themselves, protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves from predators. All of that came at a real, measurable cost to everyone else in the group. And they paid it anyway, repeatedly, across different continents, different time periods, different cultures that had no contact with each other. So why? What was actually happening psychologically and socially inside groups that made choices like this? Anthropologist Sarah Hrdwy's research into what she calls cooperative breeding offers part of the answer. Human infants are extraordinarily helpless for an extraordinarily long time compared to almost any other species. A human child cannot survive alone for years after birth. Hrdwy argues that this fact forced early human groups to develop caregiving instincts that extended beyond just the biological mother, a distributed network of caregivers who all had some stake in keeping vulnerable members of the group alive. Once that caregiving circuitry existed in a group's social structure for children, it didn't have a built-in off switch for adults who became vulnerable through injury, illness, or age. The same social wiring that kept a helpless infant alive also, almost as a side effect, extended to the injured hunter, the blind elder, the paralyzed young man in Vietnam. There's also a colder, more strategic layer underneath the compassion, and it's worth being honest about it. Anthropologists studying group dynamics in small-scale societies have found that elderly and experienced members, even those with significant physical limitations, often held enormous value as repositories of knowledge. Someone who had survived 60 winters knew things about which plants were poisonous, where water could be found in a drought, how to treat specific injuries, that younger group members simply hadn't lived long enough to learn yet. Keeping an elder alive wasn't purely sentimental. In many documented traditional societies, elders functioned as a kind of living archive, and losing them meant losing decades of accumulated survival knowledge that couldn't be replaced quickly. But knowledge alone doesn't explain Shanidar One's case, or the young man in Vietnam. A man with one arm, one eye, and severe leg damage wasn't offering much practical survival knowledge that justified decades of physical care. Something else was happening there, something closer to what we'd now just call love or loyalty, or the simple fact that once someone is part of your group, part of your family, part of the people you've slept beside and hunted with and raised children next to, abandoning them stops being a real option your mind considers, regardless of the cost. Here's the part that should land differently once you sit with it. The instinct to care for someone who can give nothing back, the pull you feel to help an elderly parent, to sit with a sick friend who can't repay you for the time, to stay up all night with a child who contributes nothing yet and won't for years. That instinct isn't something civilization invented. It isn't a byproduct of modern comfort or excess resources. It was there 45,000 years ago in a cave in Iraq, carrying a one-armed, half-blind man across difficult terrain because leaving him behind was never actually on the table. It was there 4,000 years ago in Vietnam, feeding a paralyzed young man who could offer nothing measurable in return for over 2 decades. That instinct is older than agriculture, older than written language, older than almost every other thing you associate with human civilization. It might be one of the oldest and most defining things about being human at all, older even than the tools we usually point to as evidence of our intelligence. You will probably help someone today who can't fully repay you for it. Maybe a coworker, maybe a family member, maybe a stranger. It will feel unremarkable, barely worth mentioning. But underneath that ordinary moment is something that survived ice ages, famines, and tens of thousands of years of a world with far less room for error than the one you live in now. Somewhere in that instinct is a one-armed man in a cave in Iraq, still being carried, still being fed, still somehow still here. If you want more stories like this, ones that challenge what you think you already know about human history, this channel exists for exactly that. Hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it tells the algorithm this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.